When I first heard about the NPC meme, I thought it was a perfect metaphor for a philosophical problem that I've alluded to before, but never really dealt with directly and fully. It's related to the problem of consciousness. And David Chalmers has talked about the problem of consciousness using the term philosophical zombies to describe hypothetical people who look and act as if they were conscious, but who are not. I find the NPC to be an even more useful metaphor. I think everyone is familiar with the "I think, therefore I am" argument, and it seems to me that if there's only one thing that can be known with absolute certainty, it's the fact that I am conscious. It's logically impossible to deny it, or even to doubt it. At least for me it is. It's impossible for me to doubt my own consciousness, because of course, unless I am conscious, it would be impossible to doubt. Doubt is conscious mental activity, and therefore doubt proves the existence of a conscious mind which is doubting. But of course, when we use this argument with someone else, we're assuming that they, like us, are conscious beings. But what if they're not? Even if they are, the argument can only succeed in proving the existence of their own consciousness to them. It does not prove the existence of my consciousness to them. And likewise, the argument can only prove the existence of my own consciousness to me. "I think, therefore I am" is a valid, deductive, logical argument. If I use the argument with you, I'm essentially changing the argument to "you think, therefore you are," which is also a valid, deductive, logical argument. "I think, therefore you are" is not, and neither is "you think, therefore I am." So I can prove the fact of my own consciousness to myself, and you can prove the fact of your own consciousness to yourself. But how can I know for certain whether or not you or anyone else is conscious? And how can you know whether I or anyone else is conscious? I think the best argument we could give would be an inductive argument. We're inferring consciousness in others from their behavior. I have internal subjective experiences. I have thoughts. I have intentions. I see that other people look and behave basically the same way I do, and so I infer that they also have an inner experience. I may not know exactly what it's like to be them, but I assume that it is like something to be them. I don't assume that it's like anything to be a rock, because rocks don't display any behaviors that imply awareness or intentionality. But in both cases, I'm merely inferring consciousness or lack of consciousness from behavior. I can't observe the inner subjective states of others. Maybe it is like something to be a rock, but that consciousness or subjectivity doesn't manifest itself outwardly through behavior. I'm not making that argument. I'm simply saying that I can't prove or disprove it either way. If I drop a rock and it falls to the ground, I understand that the rock was acted upon by gravity. But the fact that an object is acted upon by an outside force, or that an object lacks agency, does not necessarily imply that the object lacks subjectivity. To explain what I mean, imagine that a person is having a surgery performed on them. Imagine that they've been given an anesthetic so that they will not be conscious during the surgery, and so that they will not experience pain. In that state, they temporarily lack agency and subjectivity. They are unconscious and immobile. But I've heard of a few rare cases where a person wakes up on the operating table, but they're still paralyzed. They can't move. There's nothing they can do to let the surgeon know that they are awake and in excruciating pain. All they can do is lie there like a stone in intense agony. But the surgeon is ignorant of this. The patient appears and behaves exactly the same as a patient who is under anesthesia. Both seem to be unconscious. Neither one moves or shows any sign that they have any awareness or sensation. but one of them is conscious and does have awareness and sensation. Now we can also imagine the opposite. We can imagine two people who both seem to be conscious. They both show signs of awareness and sensation, and they both move and behave in a manner that implies intentionality. But only one of them actually has consciousness and subjectivity. The other merely has the appearance of consciousness and subjectivity. The NPC, or non-player character, would be an example of this. First, let's think about an older two-player video game such as Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. You can either play against another person or against the computer. In the first case, the actions of your on-screen opponent would be guided by the consciousness of the person controlling the character outside of the game. In the second case, the character's actions are just the result of a program. It's an NPC. I'm not a gamer, but as I understand it, there are online multiplayer games where you might be playing on a team with other players from around the world. And maybe you're playing against other teams of players from around the world. So you're controlling an on-screen avatar yourself, and you understand that other characters you see on your screen are also avatars, which are being controlled by other players like yourself. But of course, it doesn't follow from this that every character in the game is an avatar, which is being controlled by another player like yourself. Some of them, or even all of them, may not be avatars. They may simply be a part of the game, just programs. And if the program is very good, you might not be able to tell which characters are NPCs and which are avatars. Let's imagine a hypothetical online multiplayer game. Let's say you're alone at home playing the game on your computer. Let's assume that to play this game, you have to have a team of 4 players. But if it's just you, or you and 1 or 2 other people playing, you can select as many NPCs as you need to complete your team. When you log in to play by yourself, the program will either pair you up with other players who don't have a team either, or with NPCs, or with a combination of players and NPCs. And similarly, the other teams might be made up of either players, NPCs, or some combination of the two. And for all you know, you might be the only actual person playing. Maybe no one else is logged on, and all the other characters on your team and on all the other teams are all NPCs. But if the program has advanced AI, you may not be able to tell. When you dream, there are probably usually other people, and maybe animals in your dream. But most people would agree that only you, the person having the dream, are actually conscious. The other people or animals in your dream are just part of the dream. They are creations of your unconscious mind. The character you are within the dream is your avatar. Every other character in the dream is basically an NPC. Of course, one of the main differences between a dream and a video game is that in a dream you usually don't know that you're dreaming. You usually believe the dream is real. You usually believe that you actually are your avatar. You don't know that your avatar isn't really you. And you don't know that the other characters in the dream are just part of the dream. You think they're real. It's a much more immersive experience than a video game is. When you play a game, you know you're playing a game. You know that your avatar isn't the real you. You know that if you die in the game, you don't die in real life. If another player shoots at you, you don't take it personally. You understand that it's just a game. And the other player is trying to win just like you are. No matter who wins and loses in the game, in reality, you're both going to be fine. And you can always play again. So it's ridiculous to get mad over a game. But of course, it's even more ridiculous to get mad at an NPC. It's just a program, and really is doing what you want it to do. How boring would it be to play a game without conflict? And so the creator of the game programs conflict into the game. This doesn't mean the creator is evil. He's simply creating the sort of game that gamers want to play. And maybe this metaphor can shed light on the origin of evil and the problem of suffering. An atheist will often argue that it's logically impossible to reconcile the belief in an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent deity with the existence of suffering in the world. If he's all-knowing, then he knows that suffering exists. If he's all-powerful, then he has the power to stop it, or to create a world without suffering. And if he's all-loving, surely he would do so. So they conclude that God doesn't exist. Others, such as certain Gnostics, came to a different conclusion. They solved the problem by saying that this world was created by a God, but not by an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent deity. They say that this world was created by an ignorant and malevolent demiurge. And it's interesting that in some Gnostic writings, it says that when the demiurge created the first humans, he was only able to create physical bodies, but was unable to give them a spirit. In some cases, he was even able to give them a soul, but not a spirit. The Gnostics believed that the soul and the spirit were two different things. But the distinction isn't necessary to get into for the sake of this discussion. But here again, there is a parallel with the NPC metaphor. The programmer who creates the video game can only create avatars. He can't infuse those avatars with consciousness. At best, he can animate them with artificial intelligence. In other words, he can give them a kind of animal soul. That is to say, he can program them to act according to unconscious impulses. In other words, he can create NPCs. But he can also create playable characters, or avatars, and then convince gamers to play the game, and to effectively incarnate into the avatars he created and infuse them with spiritual essence, so to speak. Many schools of esoteric thought have conceived of the material world as a kind of prison. But couldn't it also be a kind of game? Many conceive of the demiurge as evil and satanic. But couldn't it also be that he's sort of like a game designer, and that he's simply created the kind of game that gamers wanted to play? It may seem like a prison to those who are unable to escape, but maybe that's because the whole point of the game is to escape. I have a friend who told me about going to an escape room. He and his friends had to solve clues to escape. Of course, there was no real danger, and he said it was a lot of fun. Maybe the material world is less like a prison and more like an escape room. It's just a much more immersive experience because we believe it's real. We believe we're in real danger. The pain we feel really hurts. We think we're going to die. Of course, it's all perfectly safe. We can't really die. Only our avatar dies. We'll continue playing the game with a new avatar, starting from the highest level we've completed, but with no memory of the previous round, because that would destroy the whole experience of the game. We would know that our avatar isn't actually us. We would know that we can't actually die, and that it's just a game. It wouldn't be the immersive gaming experience that the game maker promised us. Of course, it's possible to think of the world as both a game and a prison. Perhaps the game was intended to imprison us all along. Maybe it's a rigged game, and we're tricked into playing it. Maybe it's very much like a casino. The odds are stacked against you. The house always wins, but you're lured in by the extravagant decor and the bling and the false hope that you might get lucky and win big. After all, you can't win if you don't play, right? And so you get sucked in by the glamour and the fantasy of it all. And there's a cruel psychological trick that's being played. After you've lost a certain amount, you find that you can't just walk away. If you walk away now, you'll have lost everything. But if you play just a little longer, your luck could change and you could win it all back. And maybe you'll even hit the jackpot. And so people become addicted to gambling. They become slaves. And perhaps the material world is like this. Imagine that you're a free, pure spirit in heaven or in paradise, the pleroma, nirvana, or whatever you prefer to call it. You exist outside of space and time in a state of timeless, changeless oneness with a multitude of other beings. For many spiritual seekers, or for those who practice meditation, this might sound wonderful and blissful. Something like this is probably the goal of your practice, and is probably where you hope your spiritual journey will eventually lead you. But sometimes the greatest curse is being given exactly what you think you want. And sometimes God's greatest blessings may be the prayers He leaves unanswered. What do I mean by that? Well, let me describe what I see as the dark side of heaven. Try to understand what timelessness, changelessness, and oneness actually means. In effect, it means eternal boredom and loneliness. Some people would get mad at me for saying so. They'll say that I just don't understand what timelessness, changelessness, and oneness really means or what it's really like. But I do. In fact, I've had glimpses and temporary experiences of it at points in my spiritual journey. And it's true that the experience is one of pure bliss and love, but it only feels this way in contrast to the experience of suffering and existential alienation that we've come to know in this world. What we experience as bliss is simply the absence of suffering, and what we experience as the feeling of being wrapped in pure love is simply the absence of the agony of separateness and the longing for unity and wholeness. Without this contrast, it would only be eternal boredom and loneliness. Right now, hold your hand a few inches in front of your face. It probably feels no different from not holding your hand a few inches in front of your face. And you're probably a little mad at me for asking you to do such a pointless exercise. But if you were sitting in front of a fire on a cold night, your experience would be very different. You would feel the warmth from the fire on your face. And when you held your hand a few inches in front of your face, between your face and the fire, you would feel the absence of that warmth, and you would experience that as coolness. And of course, the reason you experience the warmth of the fire as pleasurable is because it relieves you of the suffering caused by being out in the cold. Heaven isn't heaven without hell, and so perhaps hell was created as an act of mercy and kindness. Many atheists ask Christians how a good and loving God could send people to hell for eternity. If they actually thought a little more deeply about it, they might ask how a good and loving God could send people to heaven for eternity. They think that only a cruel God would create such a place as hell. But it seems to me that it would be possible to argue that only a cruel God would not create such a place as hell. Of course, Christians usually respond that God doesn't send anyone to hell. People choose to go there, they say. Of course, this is nonsense if we think in terms of the mainstream Christian worldview. According to mainstream Christianity, basically people go to hell for not believing in Jesus or accepting Him as their personal Lord and Savior or whatever. So it isn't that they choose to go to hell. They weren't offered a choice. God is sending them to eternal torment for the sin of not believing in absurd and irrational religious dogmas without evidence. But the Christians may accidentally be right, much like a broken clock is. Maybe people do choose to go to hell. That is to say, maybe they choose to enter this world of suffering in order to escape from the eternal boredom and loneliness of heaven, or timeless, changeless oneness. Maybe they choose to endure the agony of separation from the source in order to experience the rapture of reunion. Maybe they choose to endure the normal ups and downs of an average life, simply for the pleasure of sitting in front of a warm fireplace on a cold night with the love of their life. Maybe to experience danger and adventure, whatever you desire or fear. You can experience it in the simulation universe. The simulation theory has been talked about a lot lately, and some people believe in it. I personally don't. I don't believe that this reality is literally a computer simulation. although I won't dismiss the possibility. It might be. But the view that this reality is some kind of illusion is very ancient. But the ancient view is that it's a mentally generated illusion, something more like a dream than a computer simulation or a video game. But the video game presents an interesting metaphor to consider. And in some ways it may be a better metaphor, because in a dream, only your dream self is an avatar, and every other character in the dream is essentially an NPC. In the game analogy, it's possible to imagine that the same is true. All the characters in the game, other than yourself, may be NPCs. But it's also possible to imagine that all of the other characters are avatars of other players, or that the characters in the game consist of a mixture of avatars and NPCs. And it's an interesting problem to ponder whether or not you could tell them apart. If the game was sufficiently realistic, and if the AI was sufficiently advanced, then I don't believe you could tell the difference. And as I discussed earlier, the same is true of the real world. We infer consciousness in others from behavior. If I see someone eating something, I would assume that the explanation for this was that they're hungry, or that they like the way the food tastes. I assume that the explanation for their behavior involves internal states of hunger or pleasure. But what if I were inside of a computer simulation, and this person was simply an NPC? Then I would be wrong. These behaviors, which appear to be related to inner subjective states, would simply be the result of a program. And how can we be absolutely certain that we aren't inside of a simulation? We can't be. Therefore, we can't be certain that other people aren't NPCs. We also can't be certain that they are. Maybe all of them are. Maybe none of them are. Maybe some of them are and others aren't. What should our default assumption be? I believe our default position should be to treat everyone as an avatar and not an NPC. The reason for this is simply the golden rule. If there are other players in this game, and they are uncertain whether they should treat me like an avatar or an NPC, I want them to treat me like an avatar. And so I treat every character in the game like an avatar. So can we think of any reason to think that there are NPCs in this simulation universe? Other than the argument that we can't be absolutely certain that there aren't NPCs, are there any arguments that there are NPCs? I can think of at least one. It has to do with the existence of evil. It's interesting to me that we describe particularly evil people as soulless. I think that sometimes, not always, our language points to deeper truths that we're aware of on an unconscious, intuitive level. Why might we intuitively feel that only a soulless person or an NPC could be capable of certain things? Every game has rules. And in video games, for example, there are essentially two kinds of rules. There are the rules that govern the program itself, and the rules that the players follow. The first is similar to the laws of physics or the laws of nature. The second is more like the laws of morality and ethics, or the laws of the government. A rock obeys the law of gravity, but it doesn't do so as a matter of will or choice. And there are no rewards or punishments. But I obey the law against smashing someone in the head with a rock by choice. I could disobey it, and if I did, there would be penalties. Of course, I also obey the law of gravity and the law of physics that says that I can't walk through brick walls. When I explain idealism to people, they sometimes ask something ridiculous, such as, well, how come you can't walk through walls then if the material world is an illusion? Here we can see that the simulation illustration offers the answer to this. Your avatar can't walk through walls in a video game either. The existence of rules does not disprove the simulation hypothesis or prove materialism. So let's focus on the second kind of laws, the rules of the game. There are certain things that you can do to score points, and certain things that you can do that may result in you losing points. This is something like the law of karma. But of course, the law of karma only applies to players, not NPCs. Rocks don't get rewarded for falling to the ground, or punished for levitating. But every free agent is subject to the law of karma. And I believe that we all know this. That is to say, we all have a moral conscience. We might not all be moral philosophers. We might not all be able to give a rational explanation for moral truths, but we're intuitively aware of them. Before a boxing match starts, the referee reminds the fighters of the rules. In order to play any game, it's necessary to agree on the rules before the game begins. And if we accept that this life is a kind of game, then the same must apply. Before we incarnate, we're informed of the rules. We carry an unconscious and intuitive awareness of the rules of the game within us. And when we see someone commit certain acts, we understand that he has committed an extreme violation of the rules and has incurred an unimaginable karmic debt. And it's unthinkable to us that a player would willfully place himself under such a heavy karmic debt. Why would any rational soul do that to himself? So surely that must be an NPC who's not subject to the law of karma, we think. Of course, this doesn't mean that all evil people are NPCs. Maybe some of them are, but others may actually be players like us who are just behaving completely irrationally, or who have become insensitive to their conscience, or who incorrectly believe that they can violate the rules of the game without facing the consequences, and so they try to cheat. So why might the game maker create evil NPCs? Maybe because the story of the game requires evil villains, and NPCs are necessary to do the jobs that players won't do. But to be logically consistent, since we've admitted that our belief that others are conscious is an inference from behavior, it seems we must also believe that still others are unconscious and soulless creatures based on inference from their behavior. Again, you can't be certain. But if it were you, and another player was uncertain whether you were an NPC or an avatar, you would want them to assume that you're an avatar. So you should do the same. Plus, by doing so, you're following the rules of the game and will earn points. And by not doing so, you may lose points. It's also possible that certain characters are just so boring that no one would want to play them. And so they're played by NPCs. And when I look around and see so much evil, and so many people living boring and meaningless lives, it makes me wonder whether there are far more NPCs than avatars in the world. Perhaps we're among the last survivors in a post-apocalyptic, philosophical zombie apocalypse. I'll end with that. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this discussion entertaining and thought-provoking. If so, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. And remember, you can help support my channel through Patreon or through PayPal. All of my links are in the description box below. Peace.